The first time that I'm glad that I actually brought up Jim Cooper and music education there earlier, because in some ways a lot of the music that I was finding, like the like experimental rock and progressive rock and things like that, I was finding from like internet rabbit holes, and I was getting into like 70s progressive rock a lot when I was in grade like 10 and 11. And at the exact same time that I was doing that and seeing like how composers like say Bartók or like Copeland or people like that like influenced bands like King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and yes, like the same time that I was finding those composers from that rabbit hole, the teacher that I was studying theory with privately, who hasn't lived there now for years, he moved away a couple years later now, and I don't know who would be there now that would even go down those rabbit holes. He was also showing me like the Rite of Spring and other music like that, and it was really interesting to me because up until then, like a lot of people, this is a very common thing. A lot of people say, like, a lot of people have this moment where they realize like, oh, people are still composing today. They're still living
Yeah.
composers, or because, so much of the literature or so much of the life as a classical musician is playing all of these canonical things, right? Or these dead composers, these dead white men, European composers, etc., right? Except actually, honestly, in the band programs, sometimes you play a lot of that living stuff. But yeah, so I mean, that was the first time when I was like started to go down that rabbit hole, and then I found like George Crumb from there and was like blown away, and all that kind of stuff really blew my mind. Like seeing what was possible. Like my real intro to classical music is all contemporary music. It's not anything, like it's not, it's funny because it's not unique to like other guitarist composers. It's actually kind of the norm for like guitarist composers to be like, oh, I'm into Dillinger's Escape Plan, and that's basically what Bartók and
Yeah.
Rite of Spring was 100 years ago, right? So it's not like actually that weird of a thing for like me, but it is a weird thing for the classical music as a whole to not grow up playing in these kinds of programs, taking piano lessons, taking violin lessons, doing these things. And then really the first time I met a composer would have been the faculty at the university where I did my undergrad. It would have been meeting Andrew Staniland and Clark Ross and the people that were on the composition faculty at Memorial University of Newfoundland, which is the university in the capital of that whole province. And really the only thing that remotely resembles a city in that entire province, both the island and the mainland, the Labrador region. Yeah, that would have been it. I mean, my first classical music concert was probably like audition weekend, honestly, like in person, really. I can't think of if I like a real, like beyond like a kid playing a piano piece at a small recital or at like a small local music, the Kiwanis style music festival. That would have been my first classical music concert even.
Yeah, I think my first one was the Lexington Philharmonic in Lexington, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small orchestra, and they do some cool things, but part of their pops programming was like this like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young esque
Right.
concert with like basically a cover band with the orchestral backing, and
Right.
that was the kind of music my parents knew was like 70s 80s rock, country music from the 90s. That's what I
Yeah,
kind of
mine too.
grew up.
Yeah,
Yeah, I grew
exactly.
up being exposed to that.
Yeah.
And then I there's so many parallels I feel like between us, that I kind of knew about, but like I'm really finding out about now, because
Yeah.
I also got really into like prog rock in middle school, high school. And my first CD that I bought, my first two CDs I bought with money that I'd earned myself, was Herbie Hancock's, I think, Headhunters album.
Oh, that's so much
And
more cool points than mine. But yeah, keep
well,
going.
and Yes is Close to the Edge.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and I mean, I had like, I've never admitted this before, but I had my parents buy me like the Backstreet Boys. I don't know,
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
90s
Absolutely.
music, and then whatever I could find in my dad's CD collection. But yeah, I think because of that, a lot of my music, my early music, and still today, there's a lot of mixed meters. Like, I don't know, that kind of. But the other thing you made me think of was, a friend of mine in middle school introduced me to Frank Zappa at a pretty early point. And like, I just hearing you talk about guitarists can tend to gravitate towards like Stravinsky and
Hmm.
Bartók and those early 20th century kind of styles. Zappa's Inagata Stravinsky, which is just Inagata Davida with the bassoon solo from Rite of Spring over top of it.
Of course it is.
And it's like so stupid. But I loved it. So can you discuss? This is something I that stood out to me in your bio, and that I'd love to hear more about. But can you discuss what you call the acceptance and
Yeah.
rejection of locality in your creative practice, and how the places you've lived have informed this idea? Because you're talking about growing up in Labrador City, you went to university in St. John's, which you described as the only place in the province resembling a city.
Hmm.
You spent time in New York City for a degree. You're in Toronto now, so kind of can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. This is kind of like a multi-web kind. I'm going to try not to ramble as much as possible and keep it connected and concise. But yeah, when I've thought a lot about over the years, like what influences my music, I think like a lot of people's, like upbringing and their surroundings, and as simple as like like their regions or like locality influence their music. I mean, there's so many obvious and clear like examples, and sometimes it's very overt and sometimes it's very conscious and sometimes it's very like subconscious, of course. But when I think a lot about it, I think about like that is like a very defining or driving factor of a lot of my work or my like interest as a composer or as a creator or musician in any kind of way, because it's so varied and all over the place. And when I talk about like the acceptance or like rejection of like locality, it's kind of like a lot of my work or like influences as a musician are both inspired but also kind of in spite of where I'm from. Or so in some ways they're very like inspired because I grew up listening to a lot of like hardcore music where people talk about like the scenes, like that's such like a thing in emo and hardcore and things like people, or post rock, like people talk about these like scenes that are defined by locality, like and defined by like regions. It's like, the Chicago scene or the DC scene or the LA scene. Like people talk about that stuff all the time and it's like a huge thing. So I'm like, in some ways, I'm very influenced by certain scenes and certain locations. Like I was very influenced by, before going to New York, I was very influenced by so many composers and so many things in New York, like
Right.
not only like Bang on a Cam, but also like Glenn Branca and also like obviously the New York people like Morton Feldman and stuff. So growing up, I lived in this like super isolated place, which basically had no scene, and I was very obsessed or interested in like these scenes that I felt alien to or not a part of or completely disconnected from. So that's one way that it's influenced by that. Like another way is that I've moved around so much and been in these different places. So I've been influenced by the experiences that I've had and the people that the connections that I've made there. And I think that's not an uncommon thing, obviously, to say. Like everybody would say that, but I think a big difference too is like I've always thought a lot about like post regionality, which is a very like 21st century thing. In that, yeah, I've been influenced by all these places, but my connections there like continue because of things like the internet. And I would have never discovered any of these things if it wasn't for the internet. So like that feels very like post regional to me, to continue these like even pre like lockdowns and pre like pandemic stuff where suddenly everybody had to flip to virtual. My norm before all that was finding things online or listening things online and discovering things, or talking on message boards with people like that, or collaborating virtually. And because of, like I was obviously so influenced, and like my time in New York was so huge to me, but like I really only lived there for like 2 years. It doesn't
Right.
sound like
Yeah.
a long time when you think of it, because of visa reasons. Like I was only able to be there for my master's for 2 years, but so many of my connections and collaborators and growing networks of community really like come from these kinds of places that I've been able to maintain. So a lot of like what I'm interested in is, like obviously I'm a product of these environments or like these clashing or different environments, but also in spite of them, like because not a lot of people from like Labrador or Newfoundland even ever leave there. Like they're kind of going through these cycles of what happens there, especially in Labrador. Most people that grew up there, you basically go through high school and then afterwards you get a job at the mines and you continue this kind of cycle, which I don't think there's anything wrong with, but I kind of had to get out and exist in spite of that. And actually, as like a lot of people I knew from there and still talk to from there, especially people of color, or which there's not a lot of at all from
Right.
there,
Yeah.
or queer people, like all those people had to exist in spite of these places, which
Right.
is a very common small town thing. Like that's like a very common small town narrative. But the big defining factor is that it's like way more isolated, like we said there, and harsher kind of environments there. So I could talk about it for like a long time, but I think it's kind of this multi-web kind of thing.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Klein, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist, creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.